Welcome to Puro Politics, the political podcast of the San Antonio Express-News. My name is Gilbert Garcia, Metro columnist, and I'm joined by
Carrie Clack, columnist, editorial board,
and Metro editor Greg Jefferson.
We're recording this. We're actually recording this on Halloween, and you'll probably be hearing it sometime in the next 24 hours or so. And we're basically a week before Election Day for the 2022 midterms. And we're really lucky to have someone who can help us make sense of it, because we've struggled to make sense of this election cycle. Our guest today is Professor Jon Taylor. He's the department chair and a professor in the Department of Political Science and Geography at UTSA. Professor Taylor, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Appreciate being here.
I wanted to start by asking about, and I really don't know, and you can probably give us some insight on this. I really don't know how reliable any poll is in 2022 in this,
okay,
in
time
this
to
modern
leave.
era. That's a tough one. But having said that, in the last week and a half or so, we had a poll from the Texas Politics Project, which had Greg Abbott up by 11 percentage points over Beto O'Rourke in the governor's race. Beacon Research had a poll that had essentially a dead heat, a 2-point edge for Abbott. And just very recently, UT Tyler had a poll that had Abbott up by 6 points. So when you, as somebody who is studies politics the way you do, when you have these polls are telling three completely different stories, how do you assess all this conflicting information?
First of all, you have to remember that polling is nothing more than a snapshot in time. Depends on time, date, depends on the kind of sample size. It depends on whether or not we're talking about likely voters or registered voters. Right. Those all come into play. In fact, I'll just use the UT Tyler poll, the most recent one. It actually, if you look at the margin of error, it actually shows that O'Rourke and Abbott are close to a dead heat with likely voters. It's about a 3.5 point swing. Gut feelings now come into play at this point as much as statistics. I used to teach don't teach stats anymore. I used to teach stats. Mm-hmm. And it does concern me that we see these wide swings in variability between polling, and the kinds of numbers we're seeing suggest one, a volatile race. Two, I'm holding up my cell phone, suggests that a lot of people are still not being captured because of these things, because we go back to the 1990s. In the 1990s, the American Political Science Association and the Association of basically AARP, which is the polling research people, basically it's their own organization, talked about the difficulties of polling in the 90s because of caller ID. Now we know today, when you get a cell phone call and you're looking at it like, I don't know this number, I'm not going to answer it. Yeah. That's one of the problems with polling right now.
Have they been able to get past that?
Yeah, you actually have internet polling instead. Now, people say, well, internet polling is like, voting for your favorite Spurs player. No, not the same thing. In this case, what it is, you're identifying people. You're in what's called a pooled survey, in which you have a number of people who are sampled out of the pool. Mm-hmm. And they're being given a series of questions that are basically rotated, so you can get a pretty decent kind of response from people. So what you're getting is a mix of both internet and telephone surveying. But even there's going to be error. There's always error. As we remind students in poli-sci stats classes, there is nothing that is ever 100% certain. Nothing whatsoever. Which is why you have this margin of error and confidence interval and confidence level. God, now I'm teaching a stats class. Sorry.
I guess I'm auditing stats class.
You want to be 95%. The threshold is 95% confidence. You want to be confident 95% of the time this poll is right. Which means 5% of the time it could be complete disaster, which we've seen. We've seen these polls take place in Texas and American politics and outside of America. So let's say we have a margin of error of plus or minus 3.5%. And let's say Abbott 48, O'Rourke 45. That could tell us that Abbott and O'Rourke are essentially tied. It could also tell us that Abbott has a 6-point lead. You just don't know. And that's the thing about polling is we just don't know. We have a good feel, but we're not completely certain here. Now, this is where the two campaigns, we'll use O'Rourke and Abbott, are likely doing focus groups, asking people about, how is this ad resonating? How is this particular issue resonating? Mm-hmm. What can we do and what can we say in this? And would this be a better ad than this ad? And they're doing that. You can tell based on how Abbott is focusing on O'Rourke is radical. O'Rourke is, he's, oh my God, he's going to destroy the state. That's playing in the focus group. At the same time, the O'Rourke ads are talking about Abbott has failed Texas. He's been here for 8 years. That resonates obviously with his focus groups as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, if, in 2018, when Beto O'Rourke ran against Ted Cruz for the U.S. Senate, it was a race that kind of captured the public's imagination, really on a national level. It became kind of a political rock star because of that, and created a lot of excitement. But there were also people that I know who supported him, who felt that there were some flaws with the campaign. That, for instance, he didn't necessarily do that well in the debates. He didn't. He raised a lot of money, but I think some people thought maybe it wasn't spent in the most efficient ways. There were some questions maybe about the organization. When you look at the campaign he's run this time, are there any flaws or anything that you think he could have done better?
Raise more money, but that's a perennial problem for Democrats in Texas. Always. I mean, my God, Greg Abbott is going to set the record for the most expensive campaign in Texas history, over $100 million. Beto, for goodness sakes, has raised $60 to $70 million. He's approaching Tony Sanchez 2002 levels, for goodness sakes. So, you can say fundraising. I'm being disingenuous by saying that because that's just, I mean, he's done, I will give O'Rourke credit. He's done something that a Democrat has not done in years, and that is to go into small towns, go into West Texas. Mm-hmm. To me, it was telling yesterday. Greg Abbott is in Lubbock, for God's sakes. Reddest of red areas of Texas. He's campaigning in Lubbock. That tells me maybe his internal polling is telling him that things aren't nearly as, wide between O'Rourke and Abbott as people think it is. If I were to criticize O'Rourke, it would be, and he came to UTSA, even got a photo up with him. I love him going to college campuses, and this is no disrespect to college students, those that are listening, for God's sakes, you got to turn out better. And I get trying to energize students and student voters. Great, fantastic, show up. And that's the thing. O'Rourke probably should be concentrating more on suburban Texas and suburban women in Texas, who are, to me, one of the biggest swing voters in the state right now.
Do you think that Governor Abbott is at a serious disadvantage with them right now, those suburban voters?
I think he is.
Why is that?
I think he is because if you talk about especially the aftermath of the Dobbs decision, SB 8. How shall I say this politely? Don't worry about polite. Just say it. There could be suburban moms, say in the Woodlands or in Highland Park, who are, or for that matter, Alamo Heights, who all of a sudden discover that their 16-year-old daughter is pregnant. And all of a sudden, they got to either take a trip to New Mexico or find some other alternative. They're probably not going to be very pleased that you have these laws on the books right now. I think that, particularly when you're doing things like Abbott saying things like, well, somebody can just take Plan B if they get sexually assaulted, is completely tone deaf in the way that I think the governor understands this issue. I think that hurts him. And then let's add something else to the mix. If you're talking about suburban moms, you're talking about safety. And in particular, the aftermath of Uvalde and his inability to do anything regarding, we can't change the law. We can't do anything. No, we can't fire the DPS director.
Can you think of another election when there was another issue? Actually, two issues, like you just said, Dobbs and Uvalde, which was just a great unknown going into the election day.
That's a good question, because I'm not certain that we've seen something like this where there's been several big national issues essentially impact a state race. Texas, usually you don't nationalize issues. In fact, it's the exact opposite. It's all about delivering the bacon and doing whatever as governor. And instead, what we're seeing is a nationalization of this particular campaign, for good and for bad. Abbott did this for one reason. O'Rourke made a mistake by not saying, I thought you were running for governor, not for president, by attacking Biden the whole time. Mm-hmm. That's the thing is that Abbott's been really good at nationalizing things. O'Rourke, for his part, has not done a good job of addressing issues that I know are of concern to middle-class voters and working-class voters, and that is inflation. And what are you going to do about it? The governor's not going to be able to do much about it, but he needs to address it better. And so I think, if there's, I'm trying to think of a parallel going back in Texas politics, be it 1978 with Clements versus John Hill, no. Clements versus White in 82, no. Clements versus White again in 86, no. 90, Clayton Williams.
Well, that's it.
You start thinking about that.
You mentioned Clayton Williams' 1990 race. That's been kind of a source of some inspiration,
right,
or hope for Democrats, saying that that Ann Richards trailed, I think, for the entire race.
Race.
it was unique because in Clayton Williams, you had somebody who had never held office, had a lot of money, but not a lot of political experience.
He was uniquely self-destructive.
Thank you. Exactly right.
I love that phrase.
Greg Abbott is many things, but he's not self-destructive.
Oh no, he's not self-destructive. He is, in fact, he is overly cautious.
That's right.
And that's, I think, fascinating because, I mean, Clayton Williams. I have to tell the story. I always tell this to my Texas politics class students, and it's this. I said, most of you have never heard of Clayton Williams. You know, they're really young, 18, 20 years old. I said, Clayton Williams is the fulcrum and the focus point of modern global politics, not just American politics. I'm like, what? I said, had Clayton Williams won in 1990, he would have run for re-election in 1994.
This is great.
George W. Bush would not have been able to run for governor until 1998 if he had run for anything. George W. Bush would not have become president in 2000. Clayton Williams is the fulcrum of history.
It's amazing. I believe it or not, I wrote a column along those lines many years ago, and because I go down these kind of what if rabbit holes, and I because
that's the biggest what if. Trust me.
My point was that the war in Iraq probably wouldn't have happened because George W. Bush. I mean, I think he was uniquely obsessed with Iraq.
Oh yeah,
and coming out of 9/11,
Obama doesn't get elected. Then Obama doesn't come on the scene. Maybe if there's no Iran,
it's quite possible.
So Clayton Williams,
Trump may not come on the scene.
Same thing.
So I think thanks to you now we have actually determined Clayton Williams is the most important political figure of our lifetime.
In our lifetime. It's amazing to think.
We should just end now.
It's like, did not blow your mind.
We're done.
Well, you were saying that was great. We made the point about the suburbs, and I mean, there's some sense of realignment. Republicans are trying to make inroads in the Valley and heavily Latino areas. Democrats are certainly doing better in the suburbs, but the state's growing so much. The Latino part of the population is growing. There's been this sense among Democrats for as long as I can remember that time is on their side. What do you make at this point? I mean, they're still losing the statewide elections, but there have been some 2018. There were some closer races,
closing the gap.
What do you think?
Well, there's a phrase we use again in political science: demography is not destiny.
Yeah,
and the result is that just because there's a burgeoning Latino population does not mean that all of a sudden Texas is going to turn blue this year or in 26 or in 2032. In fact, you're going to have to sell Latino voters, much like you have to sell Black voters, white voters, or anybody else on your policies and your ideas. And so I think this is where the Trump people, and in particular the Republicans, have tried to make inroads in the Valley. They claim, it was a big turnaround in 2020. Trump got all these votes. He didn't win any of those counties, people need to remember. But he came close, obviously, and that's what kind of spooked people. Republicans, for their part, decided, let's do some really big get-out-the-vote efforts. Outreach efforts. So they created 2 outreach centers, one in McAllen and one in San Antonio, to try to start focusing on Latino voters. It first paid off with John Lujan's election, the special election in 118. We'll see if he survives the regular election this time. And then you saw the Democrats fumble the ball in the biggest way I think possible in this state in the last year, and that is to not run a strong candidate in the special election for CD 34. They gave the Republicans an easy win. And the result is now the Republicans have been able to shift the narrative to South Texas is going Republican. South Texas is turning red. We're going to have the 3 Latinas all elected in 34, 28, and 15. Let's see in a week. Slow your roll. But it is something Democrats need to focus on, because the Democrats, and they've said, and you see this in polling, Latino voters will say, much like Black voters will say, you're taking us for granted as Democrats. You need to sell us, and you need to continue to sell us.
This is a crazy thought, right? So the Texas GOP is making inroads in South Texas among Hispanic voters. Is it simply a matter of how they talk to Latino voters, or at some point is their courtship of this electorate, like, is it going to be reflected in the policies, like what they actually do at the legislature?
Yeah, that's a good question. Let's see what happens in January 23. Right. I'm not holding my breath. It's going to necessarily translate into Greg Abbott, T.O. Greg. All of a sudden deciding he's, Latino Texans' best friends in the legislature. I got my doubts of that. In particular, Republicans in the legislature in general, when you've got a lieutenant governor, is even more hostile. This is why I found it amusing the other day when the governor I guess it was in Houston, he said that he was open to casino gambling. Mm-hmm. Sure, Greg, whatever you say. That said, who's the person that's going to stop that if he's reelected? Dan Patrick immediately. So it's kind of an empty promise on the part of Greg Abbott. That's my thought regarding Latinos, is that Abbott can make these lofty promises, but I doubt he's going to deliver on them. The first thing he's going to talk about. We know this already. He's talked about it already. We're going to have a $27 billion surplus for going into the 23 session. Half of it's going to be used to pay down property taxes. Okay, let's see what happens with that even too, and how long that lasts. With all the other pressing priorities, I'm not sure what's going. The governor, how he's going to succeed on that. You've got some more Freedom Caucus Republicans in the state legislature pushing for the abolition of property taxes in this state. To which I then ask the question: how are you going to pay for government, other than the fact that you're big believers in minimalist government? How are you going to pay for the basic services of state government? The answer is raising sales tax to what, 25?
I was going to say that. Yeah,
25 cents on the dollar. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. My God. Well, this is probably asking too much of you. But while we're here,
people do it all the time. Come on, man.
I'm just
my 14-year-old son does it. Come on.
Yeah. Can you help us? Can you help explain for us the phenomenon? I guess Ken Paxton's political survival. I mean, this is someone who's been indicted for 7 years.
If I ever get indicted, I want his attorneys.
And this, I mean, he got primary too. It isn't just. I mean, we know it's a Republican state, and if if you're in the general election and you're a statewide candidate, you've got a big advantage. I mean, but he had legitimate competition in the primary this year, and how has he managed, do you think, to survive?
Part of it, I think, is right place, right time. That is part of it. Second is he has. I was almost going to use a curse word.
That too is fine.
He has basically, as close as you can possibly get to putting his face at the derriere of MAGA, essentially.
Yeah.
And so he is so tight with that. He's got rewarded for it. Mm-hmm. He's shifted to where he's now, the spokesman when it comes to anybody attacking Texas values. We're going to go after trans kids. We're going to go after this. We're going to go after that. Those red meat issues resonate, we know, with a certain percentage of Republican voters, which are the primary voters. They tend to be his base of support for a general election. You got a lot of people who are like, after 7 years, going, what was he indicted for? I don't even understand the issue. Yeah. And they don't get it about the fact that securities fraud is involved here. That is not just securities fraud. It's also, harassment in his office, questions about corruption in his own office, Attorney General. There's also the whole relationship, which I think is a little bit incestuous myself. Yes, I know they're married, but a state senator being married to the Attorney General of Texas, to me, is a concern. But voters, you can't put that on a bumper sticker. So instead, what do we get? We get Paxton following that Republican playbook right now of Rochelle Garza's radical. She's going to open the borders. I'd like to know who thought open borders for every Republican candidate was the way to go. I get some flyer for, I forget her name, who's running for land commissioner.
She's going to open the borders.
Buckingham.
Buckingham. And what she's saying, we're going to close the borders. We're going to stop Biden's inflation. I'm like, you have nothing to do with either one. But there we are.
Yeah. Yeah, well, even the Beto O'Rourke, he's going to defund the police. I mean, he's not running local police departments.
No. Ironically, if we want to be perfectly honest here, the Republicans are more likely to defund the police if you talk to Harris County officials right now.
Yeah.
We're in this unique point in history. We're coming off of Donald Trump refusing to accept the 2020 presidential election results, the January 6, 2021 insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. I'm just curious, like how concerned you are about, the future of our ability to have a functioning democracy in this country. What the prospects
That's an excellent question, because it's actually been brought up many times in our classes. Actually, before I answer that question, I should note 2 of the 3 top Republican officials in the state are essentially election deniers. Dan Patrick and Ken Paxton, who, by the way, joined the lawsuits regarding the whole election denial stuff. Greg Abbott has been disingenuous, but at the same time, I think we know where his heart is. So you have a real problem here in that you have a substantial portion of the electorate who are not agreeing or somehow buying into the legitimacy of our system, essentially, by accepting the results of an election. I don't care. You got apparently Kerry Lake's people in Arizona saying, well, unless Kerry wins, it's going to be election fraud there too. You had Bolsonaro people yesterday. And in fact, MAGA people, I'm using Steve Bannon, saying it's been stolen, a stolen election in Brazil. My fear is that every single election we're now going to have, next city council race in San Antonio, it's stolen from me. I mean, it has to end. Because this coarsening is going to lead to delegitimizing the system and opening the door to a greater acceptance, and this is one of my greatest fears, a greater acceptance of authoritarianism, a greater acceptance of a reduction in rights, and a strengthening of the hand of those in authority.
Well, one of the things that concern me is, and part of this is kind of a semantic thing, and maybe doesn't mean as much, but it's started to concern me a little bit more over the past couple of years is, among people in the Republican Party, over the years, I've heard the argument made that we're not a democracy, a constitutional republic. Which again, I get, I feel like,
oh God, I run into that as a professor.
All the time. And which again, I kind of put that aside. I thought, well, it's semantics. Who cares? But my recollection is, I think this was after the November 2020 election. You had Senator Mike Lee saying something along the lines of, democracy is really not what this country's all about. It's about preserving liberty. That's what the basis of our country. It's not democracy, and that kind of spooked me a little bit because I thought, he's just one senator, but I think there are others in the Republican Party who probably see things the way he does. And I thought if we're really getting to a point where we're thinking democracy is not really the objective here. If a democratic system isn't producing the results that we want, then
they'll chuck it for something else.
Yeah.
I mean, you'd be amazed how often I get emails from irate people in the public, especially if I write a commentary for you guys. But especially I'll get stuff, and they're usually with F-bombs involved and such as well. America is not a democracy, it's a republic.
Yes.
To which I'm like, okay, technically, democracy is not mentioned. Yeah, it's a constitutional republic with the democratic mechanisms that are in place. Mm-hmm. It's called representative democracy. If you doubt that's the case, then I guess you're not voting for members of the House, the Senate, legislature, whomever. That you don't understand the way that checks and balances works in this country, and you need to take our POL 1013 American Politics class, for God's sakes. Thank God the legislature requires it for all colleges and universities in the state. Otherwise, people will get no exposure to this stuff, which is even more frightful. And so you listen to this and you're thinking, okay, what's your alternative? Plebiscitary democracy in which we have a strong man basically determining national policy and referenda? That's the end of not just democratic rule, that's the end of freedom that you supposedly so hold dear. It will go by the wayside very quickly. And there are many examples in history, not in our country, fortunately, but in a number of countries where that happens, where somebody takes power and then they decide, because in the name of national security, in the name of a national emergency, in the name of stability, we have to measure temporarily certain things. And those temporary things become much more permanent over time. And then that's when we all will be fleeing for Canada or Mexico. Seriously.
Well, along those lines, I think part of what's creating this climate is a sense that people in the opposition party, they're not just the opposition anymore. They're the enemy, and they're evil, and they're trying to destroy the country. And then that sort of mindset I think justifies a lot of extreme behavior. And last Friday morning, someone broke into the home of the U.S. Speaker of the House, the Democratic Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, apparently looking for her, ended up attacking her husband and sent him to the hospital. Fortunately, it looks like he's going to survive the attack. But the person is, based on what we've heard, is a right-wing extremist. And, it's a horrifying incident. But we have had we've certainly in this country gotten used to the idea that there are deranged individuals who will, threaten or commit acts of violence against political figures or celebrities. It's a horrible thing that we've gotten used to it, but this does happen. But one of the things that really shocked me about this story was not just the incident itself, but the reaction to it. And the fact that from Republicans, when I saw them, either elected officials or people who represent the party, when they were interviewed, there was a lot of defensiveness, saying, "Well, we're not to blame for this," or some even saying it's crime is the result of democratic policies, as if this was just a standard crime, as if he got mugged when he was walking down the street. This was a political assassination attempt.
Thank you.
But so there's that kind of thing. But you also have someone like Jesse Waters on Fox News. I think his quote was something like, "A lot of people get hit with hammers," or something. Which and you had Donald Trump Jr. retweeting someone who basically mocked this attack. So I don't really know where I'm going with this, aside from just wondering what you make of as a student of history. I mean, when you look at assassination attempts against political figures in this country, I mean, my memory is that there was no partisanship at that point. That there was kind of this unified response. There was compassion for the person, for the family, and sort of people rallying behind that person. And we're not seeing that.
No, we're not. In fact, what we've seen instead is a coarsening of our politics. In fact, there's a phrase I would like people to commit to memory. The cruelty is the point when it comes to the way that people are posting this stuff. That, and if it's not the cruelty that they're posting, it's about whataboutism. What about what the Democrats said about this and about that? Okay, here's a novel idea. How about both sides set aside and actually act civil? Novel idea. Act like human beings. To somehow claim, as some people have claimed, this was a false flag. It's designed to force yet greater measures to try to put down MAGA and put down. No, it's called spewing years and years worth of insane QAnon hatred. Hi, QAnon people, if you're listening.
They're not listening.
I think our ratings are really low, actually.
To somehow claim, all this just lunatic fringe stuff, and to somehow, and for a former president to give a nod to it on a regular basis, to encourage violence, and he does in his rallies. He talks about beating up and jailing reporters. And then if you read, his supporters who are retweeting stuff and saying their own stuff, who are talking about executing reporters, executing academics. Okay, that ain't America, the one at least I grew up in. And to move toward that direction is the end of what we knew of this country and our so-called democratic experiment. I can't say democratic to certain people, though, because it's not democracy. But I think, and I'm old enough to remember, Reagan's attempted assassination. Okay, people made jokes. Even Reagan made jokes about it. I mean, he made jokes about it when he came back and gave a joint speech to Congress, for goodness sakes. Made a joke the day he was shot to the surgeons. But you think about, especially, honestly, I sometimes would argue, and there's a debate in poli-sci about this, kind of when this move toward what seems to be almost an exponential move toward extremism has taken place. Some could argue, well, after Bush Gore, maybe, kind of. After the Gulf War, so the Iraq War started, maybe. I still tend to trace it from the time Obama was elected. That you begin to see this extremism become much more acceptable. The Tea Party movement, as it started out as an opposition to spending. But then it kind of metastasized. I wasn't even going to say metamorphosis. Metastasized into something much more virulent, much more hardcore right wing, and in that atmosphere, in that environment, Trump was able to roll right into place and was able to take full advantage of it. And what we've seen, especially since 2015-16, is this just real move toward polarization. Much more so than I think we've experienced at any time since, before the American Civil War. Not that I'm saying there's going to be a second Civil War, But this high degree of polarization is and should be concerning to all, because it's got to be toned down, because you're going to continue to see nut jobs attack politicians. You're going to see them attack individuals who hold political views. You just are. Mm-hmm. It's got to stop.
Do you think? I mean, but is there really any way back from that? Like once you reach this kind of
part.
I mean, that's the thing. Like I have a real question about whether you can. Can you reel it back in? This kind of hateful rhetoric, the political violence. How do you end it? I don't know that it's stoppable.
It's funny you say that. I would agree. It's almost, the pessimism when you say we've reached the point of no return. And then you start seeing things on Twitter with these people who talk about, we just need to separate the red states and blue states. Have fun, red states, because your economy's got about 1/4 of the blue states, but go for it. You see these just crazy screeds of people talking about civil war, talking about getting the military to step in, and we got to do this, we got to get all these people rounded up, send them to Guantanamo, blah, blah, blah. Just crazy stuff. And I'm not going to fault them, but I will. Social media does play a role here. It's an open platform. Anybody can say pretty much anything they damn well please. And now with dear old Elon Musk owning the show, you're seeing a spike in all sorts of just objectionable, virulent, phraseologies. And all of a sudden now we're attacking people of color. We're attacking Jews. We're attacking Muslims. Why? Because now apparently it's fair game to do that. That to me is a symptom of a larger problem in our society. And how do you get, pull back from the brink? I mean, education, it's all well and fine when I can try to educate people, but a lot of people aren't going to listen to me. Media, the same thing. Oh, well, you guys are all fake media, fake news. Mm-hmm. And if you're to that point, it's like, my God, how do you do this? Mm-hmm. Religious leaders, nobody's going to listen to them. I think of my son, 14-year-old, thinking, what kind of country is he going to live in 10, 15 years from now? If this crap continues? The answer is, it's not a country I want him to live in. I'll move him to Canada.
Yeah. One theory that I've heard is that, looking at this historically, is that for all our political division that we had going back decades, that during the Cold War, the country was united against it. We had a common foe, and the political division sort of took a back seat to that. And once that was gone, the natural impulse was we started turning inward and the conspiracy theory started to really grow. I mean, do you see?
There was some of that, although I would say even in the 50s and 60s, you had John Birch types and extreme Republicans screaming about the conspiracy and all this. In the 80s, you had some Democrats, particularly on the left, who opposed aspects of the Cold War and particularly Reagan's adventures in Central America and that sort of thing. But generally, there was that axiom that politics stops at the water's edge. And there was at least relatively, not completely, but relatively united foreign policy and continuity between Republican and Democratic administrations. Now, you can make the argument, well, Reagan kind of broke that. No, he really didn't, because even Bush 41 followed, and even Clinton followed the same way. Even Bush 43 followed the same way. Although Bush 43 is in some respects, I think, the guy who kind of begins the unraveling of this because of the global war on terrorism, because of the focus on nation building in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And it broke American foreign policy. It broke the intelligence community. Mm-hmm. And it broke, in many respects, respect by the American public toward those institutions. And so it opened the door. I have this one person, and hopefully he's not listening to the podcast because he's in the Houston area. God help me. He's one of these people who was reasonable 15, 20 years ago and is now looking at the World Economic Forum, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Bilderbergers and others are basically all in cahoots with each other, controlling one world government. Everything that you're seeing is nothing but false flags. It's like, fortunately, we don't have that many people like that, but it opens the door to that sort of thing. And that's where, again, I worry, where do we go politically in this country when you have that stream of thought being given legitimacy? There has to be a way to delegitimize this kind of crazy rhetoric, this kind of just radical rhetoric that plays to the extreme, plays to the most base instincts of individuals.
Well, before we wrap things up, I wanted to ask you, I hate to ask you to play prognosticator here because
You better be right.
All predictions wrong or double your money back.
one of the things I've learned actually is that sometimes I've when you talk to people who are like coaches and stuff like that, they're often like the worst at picking
of course they are.
The results of games, and people who campaign managers often they're often totally wrong on predicting political results. But we got you here, so I was going to ask you. So much speculation on the 2024 presidential race already, and I mean, when you look at, it seems obvious Donald Trump's going to run again. I mean, do you think he'll get the nomination?
If he runs, he will.
Yeah.
If he doesn't run, let's see what happens with DeSantis in Florida next week. If he survives or not. Yeah. And the same thing with Joe Biden. Joe Biden is actually prudent not to say he's running for re-election. I think we all know he likely will not run for re-election. I mean, who does that?
Who's the obvious person?
Gavin Newsom, I would say. Yeah, I would say he's probably the most likely. Not just me. Kamala Harris, I think will give him a run for his money. There's a few others as well, but I think Newsom has positioned himself, honestly, to be the alternative for Democrats. Now, DeSantis, there are going to be Abbott people listening. Oh, Greg Abbott. Okay, fine. Greg Abbott for president. At CPAC, he registered exactly 0% support back in Dallas a few months ago. Nobody thinks about Greg Abbott running for president, to which then Abbott would say, well, yeah, Donald Trump was at 0 or 1% back in 2015. Okay. With all due respect to the governor, he doesn't have quite the bombastic personality of Donald Trump. So you would assume Donald Trump would run. Now, the question is, based on everything we know, based on potential for indictments, potential for all sorts of things in the next few months. Could we see a prospect where you have Donald Trump running essentially while under indictment, like Ken Paxton, running for president? Quite possible. We could even go so far as to have him, sitting in jail temporarily and running for president. We've seen that members of Congress do it. There's nothing to stop him. Right. We could see. Conventional wisdom would say it's going to be a replay of 2020, Trump versus Biden. That would be the conventional wisdom. I don't. It's one of these things. Bet the garbage, not the rent, on that happening.
Would Newsom? Do you think he'd be a formidable nominee if that happened?
I think he would. He'd be able to raise an insane amount of money. Yeah. The thing about Newsom is he survived a recall challenge. He survived Kimberly Guilfoyle.
I was going to ask. I wasn't sure if I should go in that area. I went there. How's that going to play out?
That'd be bizarre. That will make for a bizarre presidential election. It just will. Oh my God. But this is American politics these days. I was afraid you were going to ask for a prediction on O'Rourke versus Abbott. I can give you 3. See, I'm hedging my bets big time.
Good.
Okay, the one is the conventional, that Abbott wins by about anywhere between 5, 7, maybe 8 points. Yeah. That's the conventional one, based on polling, based on averages of averages. The other is that Abbott outperforms those numbers, much less likely. Yeah. And there's the third scenario, and there I see a path to this. It's not an easy path. About 22 to 24% of new voters in Texas are new voters. They've never voted before. Now, we can make assumptions on those new voters. In the aftermath of the Dobbs decision, how many of them are women and persons of color who are concerned about certain issues related especially to reproductive rights and to Uvalde, among others. If those people turn out as they did in Kansas for the constitutional amendment question, all of a sudden we're looking at Governor Beto O'Rourke. Not by a lot, but possible. Is it likely? No. But I think, given O'Rourke's history, I think we're going to see an election outcome that's going to be much closer than people think. Again, I'm not saying O'Rourke's going to win. Yeah. It'd be, okay, as a political scientist, I would love to see it happen because As Mao Zedong once said, there is chaos under heaven and the situation is excellent.
What a way to wrap things up. Professor Taylor, it was great having you on the podcast.
Pleasure.
Thank you so much.
All right, you bet.
And for everybody listening in, hope you're doing well. Get out and vote if you haven't already, and we'll be back with you next week. I think we're going to actually do a podcast next week, the day after the election, because we want to be able to talk about the results. So hope you're doing well. Take care.